Last week, we began our conversation with Noah Schumerth and George Fletcher. We talked about the role of the library in the technologically enhanced smart city of today and the future. Let's continue that conversation.
Well, George and Noah, we talked last week about urban places and how they will be increasingly saturated. I believe, Noah, your word was a continuous ongoing tide of technology and information. And George, you mentioned this also. Our education and our information is now in our pockets. It's on our walls. What will that distribution look like? What are some ways we're going to be able to distribute that information? George, you kind of mentioned that about it being in your pocket. Do you have any thought on that?
First thing, and I may take this off a little different direction, but there's some real fundamental issues we're going to have to address as a society about some of the smart city initiatives. The first being privacy. Already, the ability to read your car license or your face or whatever, and the amount of information that can be collected for one person is scary. And so there are some fundamental lines we're going to have to draw for privacy. I guess that's my first thought about smart city technologies.
Right. I agree with George that I think that's the central question about the distribution of technology in the smart city era. And that's privacy. I don't think we figured out that question yet. I mean, right now, for example, in local governments, we're having a huge problem of cyber attacks and people able to get data through means that we're not prepared for whatsoever. And when we're collecting a lot of, sensitive data or, really valuable data, I think that gets really, really troublesome. I think that's always just kind of a reason to caution, and really, because privacy is a question that inherently we have to think beyond technology, and think what are the things that are kind of inherent to human beings, what belongs to them, what do they have a right to privacy for. I think that distribution of technology, first and foremost, is going to have a really important conversation about personal rights and what makes us human, what do we have a right to? What does a community have a right to protect?
Public safety is the trade-off there.
Right.
But another major issue has to do with truth, understanding truth, getting at truth, fake news, etc. And again, one of the difficulties of this enormous production of information is what is truth? What is fact?
We just talked about that on our episode last week, you guys. You need to listen to Propaganda and Perspective.
Right. And so, I think that then if we look at that distribution of technology, which is going to be coming not only through phones and TV screens, but also just in new ways of displaying data in kind of this continual integration of everyday learning with data. I look at this as a comprehensive planner, for example, with the fact that our comprehensive plans are increasingly inundated with maps and figures and data that just all of our decisions are slowly being integrated with this empirical analysis and this data. I think there's a positive and negative to all of this data distribution. So there's the positive, right, that access is far more widespread, especially with the generation that's coming up that's growing in all of this and doesn't have those same technological barriers as some other people might. And so if you want access to it, you can. It really revolutionizes self-learning and your own exploration of truth, and which I think is important. I think that was one of the principles behind, say, the Protestant Reformation, one of the larger events of human history, in that it distributed, for example, the Bible. I mean, it was fueled by the innovation of the printing press. And it just massively democratized the ability to discern biblical truth, for example, and that became a real bedrock principle of the Protestant Reformation. There's also a negative aspect to that, right? We have this issue of everyone thinks that they're an expert, right? Everyone's knowledge becomes individualized and kind of isolated from everybody else's knowledge, and that can be really damaging. It can lead to a distrust of experts and the negative side of populism. And I think that you need an institution to be able to ground people's individual opinions and ideas and kind of budding expertise to larger conversations and to more communal knowledge. And maybe that's a place where libraries can fit in.
That's an excellent point. I love your analogy with the printing press and smart cities. I mean, you can almost see historical duplication of this information that's now being disseminated. But it would be interesting to see what are the plumb lines going to be in the smart city technology. What's going to keep us, as you said, George, in truth when we think about this?
There was an article in The Atlantic in 2018 that was critical of smart cities. It said, smart cities will use the techniques of smartness to leverage their regional competitive advantages. Instead of being speed of light, flat world platforms, all global and multicultural, they'll be digitally gated communities with code as law that is as crooked, complex, and deceitful as a Facebook privacy chart. Clearly, the author did not approve of smart cities. Do you think that's true? Will smart technology further the educational gaps between economic classes, George?
Well, both the educational and the economic gaps are growing, and that's a problem. I have trouble with just fundamental planning functions in smart cities. I mean, if we convert to electric cars, and we are, I mean, the logarithmic growth of electric cars by 2024 is the inflection point, they're saying. And that's necessary to take the next step, the autonomous vehicle. But more importantly, alternative modes of transportation suggest that maybe people aren't going to own their own car, and have it sit around for 23 hours a day. The ride sharing that Noah mentioned. I just don't know how you incorporate all of that into planning, and I didn't exactly answer your question because I think it's above my pay grade, but I'll give Noah a chance to answer it.
Yeah, so I think that there's an educational gap, that definitely gets exacerbated, but I think even more so, to get to George's point about planning for these sorts of things, there really are inevitable inequalities that can be exacerbated when you apply smart city technology to the reality of public economics. So here's an example. You mentioned autonomous vehicles. So, there's been a lot of talk of shared vehicles, for example, where people are rescinding personal car ownership and, in moving towards kind of more of a universal ride-sharing program. I'm skeptical of that, and I've seen some analyses that show that if there's access to do it, and I don't think that there's political will to ban it, and I don't know where you would find the justification for it, you will end up with people who can afford to upgrade their vehicles, or because, for example, right now the average autonomous vehicle sensor for entry-level one is somewhere around $9,000 with the new remote sensing technology that's coming out. People will be able to have their own personal vehicles that are autonomous, and they can have the benefits of self-driving vehicles to themselves with their own personal vehicles. But then if you're trying to build a ride-sharing economy, that ends up with the problem of public transit systems in the United States. So a shared good, like ride-sharing, for example, can only survive if it has input from all economic classes participating in that service. And so I think you're going to have the problem where if it's only then serving low-income individuals or people who can't access that market of, their own self-driving vehicles, I think they could end up at a major disadvantage in terms of being able to move around a city because those ride-sharing endeavors won't be able to work economically. It's the reason why we don't have really robust mass transit systems in the United States, or at least one of the reasons.
I've got to respond to that, guys.
Totally.
I'm sorry.
Great.
Go ahead.
All over the country, public transportation systems don't work in less dense cities. And the reason is you can't get from your house to the bus stop or your apartment or whatever, or from the bus stop to where you need to go. And this is the great potential for autonomous vehicles. And it doesn't have to be a big full-size sedan. It could be a three-wheel tricycle that's covered. It could be a golf cart. Public transportation needs to be redefined. You don't have to have great big buses for every route. Maybe you have smaller buses or connector buses. But you've got to solve the what's called the first last mile problem. And I do think that that's the short-term future for autonomous vehicles.
That's an excellent point.
The vehicles that you have now are going to run themselves, but.
And, I would disagree with you there, but I don't think the debate necessarily is on, the economics of public transit. So I'll leave that be for now, but I guess maybe to bring it back to what we were talking about, I do think that there's the potential then, at least for smart technology, I think to really exacerbate some existing divisions between economic classes. I'm very skeptical that it's going to be something that kind of universally lifts people up over time.
Here's my concern about it, that it's not so much the knowledge gap as the fact that the smart city technologies are going to take over more and more of the low-income jobs. And without the educational resources or base, people are going to be hunting for work, and the poor are going to get poorer. And I think that's the biggest threat of the smart city technologies.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
Restaurants.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move to another topic here.
Well, as we're thinking about that, if we think about it nationally for a big country like the U.S., there's also the division between cities and rural communities. Already, it's more than a first mile, last mile problem when we talk about transportation in rural communities. It's a first 20 mile, last 20 mile problem. And if we build these well-enhanced, technologically infused cities, and then we leave rural communities and small towns as they are, don't we also further exacerbate problems of equalities of opportunities and equalities of access between rural and urban communities, and maybe also educational divisions between cities and rural communities?
Well, that's been happening. I mean, even before the smart city technologies hit.
Sure.
Right, but does this accelerate it?
Yes.
Yeah.
In a big
South
way.
Carolina and the ETV bandwidth was a classic case of that.
Oh, you nailed it, George. And we see that in education. Just look at what we call the corridor of shame. You've made that very clear.
If I can hop in, I've got a thought on that rural development. I think that's going to be really interesting how smart city technology really interacts with, I would say, a kind of a rural way of life. So, for example, farms are far from technologically unadvanced places. Farms are just incredibly technologically integrated. The idea of the dumb farmer is not one that's accurate at all. Farmers around here in Wisconsin, the dairy farmers, are some of the most brilliant people that I've ever met.
They've got $500,000 worth of technology sitting in their barns too.
Right, but technology is just distributed so differently in a rural place. In rural places, for example, property has always taken a very high priority compared to cities where you're sharing very limited space, and private property does not take as much of a role. And so when you have a smart city technology, which is generally kind of has this language of being shared, of shared resources from the shared vehicles we were talking about earlier, to public services that provide the opportunity to, again, this technological innovation and data gathering. I think that's just very different than how technology might play out in a rural community where a lot of that technology will be increasing efficiency on, say, your own property and managing your farm or your preserved property or what have you. Whereas I don't think that some of these technologies will be looked at all that fondly, just because I think just the way the priorities and I think political life and social life in general is structured is just so different in a rural place. It's going to be so interesting to see how smart city technology intersects with that divide. That divide really transcends technology.
Right. Right now we're shutting down hospitals all over South Carolina because you can't afford to keep them running, and they're going to do all the examinations remotely, and then you've got to go to a city to get treated.
Right. Lots of those things to consider. And so one of the things that I want to talk about, just ask a quick question, because I was actually watching an interview yesterday and they were talking about smart cities. And Noah and George, I know you were waiting for this question because there's got to be buy-in from the public. And one of the arguments that keeps coming up is, how is this technology going to help me, the average citizen? And what is that going to do? Is there a health risk? That conspiracy that's come out, So, George, what do we know about health risks in smart cities?
Well, what we know is it's being driven by the private sector, and they're distributing it and implementing it where it makes economic sense. It's not the cities that are implementing the smart city technology for the most part.
So the health risk is coming from the private sector?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Noah, let me hear your take on it.
I think George is right. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the private sector plays by a very different set of rules than, say, a city government like here, where we have very strict guidelines about what can be released, what can't be. We don't do things, like data distribution wouldn't be for monetary gain, things like that. We can't do that. But the private sector has that ability. We haven't really thought about data as what exactly is data? Is it a good that can be bought and sold? What is it exactly? I think that the smart city era really transcends those boundaries of ownership in a really peculiar way. And so I think that, I would have to agree with George. One of the greatest health risks is just the lack of accountability in the private sector with this sort of thing. And how do you regulate data distribution? You have to define what data is exactly and how it's going to be regulated.
Excellent point.
Well, let me give you one example. San Francisco is trying to take over. They're trying to establish a data utility, just like you'd have an electric utility or a water utility or a sewer utility, so that they can control that sort of thing, and where the fiber gets run and where the small cells are and how to prevent a digital divide within the city. Remember, these 5G small cells have got to be placed on poles every 1,200 feet. This is an enormous investment.
Yeah.
San Francisco wants to do it themselves.
I really appreciate the insight to the health question, and it sounds like we're on the same page with that. Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, there's two additional ideas that I thought of that might be worth considering. The first is as we innovate new technologies, we tend to work faster than we're able to understand maybe some of the damages or some of the negative effects of that technology. An example of this is how we understand, say, things like radiation from cellular communication devices, not phones necessarily, but things like a 5G antenna on top of a streetlight pole in a city, for example. It gives off some degree of radiation, and we're not entirely clear as to what the effect of that is on individuals. And I think sometimes when we when we're thinking about smart cities and thinking about technology being everywhere in cities, we don't pause and consider what some of the possible health effects are, and it doesn't benefit the private sector who is implementing a lot of these technologies to kind of slow down and consider those health effects. You can just kind of keep pushing forward and innovating, which is what they're in the business of doing. So that's one effect. And the other thing I would say is less of like a physical health effect, and I think is more of just thinking about health for society, of kind of social health, is maybe the downside of just thinking constantly about innovation and the integration of technology into everything. It really fuels, I think, an idea that we've gotten really addicted to, especially since the Industrial Revolution, that we can use technology to solve most of our problems. When you look at, say, somebody trying to solve climate change, usually it's, we invented this tool to do this. We invented this power source to do this. And it doesn't really get to those foundational human questions of, do we just need to use less? Do we just need to rethink the way that we structure society and economic gain? And I think that's a possible negative health effect when it comes to smart cities, is maybe thinking that all of our problems in cities can be solved with just the right invention or the right application of a tool. When in reality, we need to think about maybe fundamental human questions about equality, about public goods and private goods. These questions that really you can't solve with technology. They've been around since the dawn of human civilization, and they always will be. They're what make up human life. That's maybe a negative consequence I could think of.
How about you, George? I know you had one thing to say.
Well, I wanted to respond to the health effects of the small cells. I mean, there's radiation coming from your cell phone.
Right.
I think we've always relied on the federal government. I mean, I bet I get 3 a week from somebody saying, hey, you don't want to put any more small cells because, it's going to kill us all. And they have references to scientific studies and all this. Cities can't decide that. States can't decide that. It's like any other technology area that I've been working with in the environmental practice over the last 40 years. The federal government sets standards. If those standards aren't right, you modify them. But you can't make those decisions at the local level. And so I think we are dependent on the federal government to establish health guidelines for those things.
That's an excellent point.
One other response I wanted to make to the health risks, for example, in rural communities, hospitals or the medical professions themselves are driven by economics, whether they're private hospitals or public hospitals, nonprofits. But the economics are still there. That was my point.
Right,
it's not
sure.
something that the government's deciding what's proper health care in the rural area.
Yeah, and
Okay, so time out. 1 second, time out. We're gonna have to wrap this up. I hate to tell you, we could probably go on for 2 hours, but we're gonna hit you with our signature question, and that is, what is a metaphor to help us understand smart cities and anything involving literary aspects of smart cities?
Let's see.
What would be a metaphor to help us understand?
Right.
Metaphor. I don't know that the previous iterations of technology, if you look at the great drivers of the Industrial Revolution, railroads, for example, or steam or electricity, well, there's some metaphors there, but I'm like before, smart technology involves data, and it's sort of a different world. I don't know of a good metaphor.
Okay, that's all right. How about you? Know anything?
Yeah, like I said, I'm still thinking. I apologize, I'm taking so long. I did think about this previously, but I don't necessarily like where I was going, so I'm trying to think of.
How about if we email it to you?
There you go. We can
That'll
add it to. I will say something that I think both of you were saying, and I'm going to kind of wrap it up with this. George, you talk about this idea of industry and the rails and the Industrial Revolution. And Noah, you mentioned something about navigating and tide. And I wonder, there's that idea of, when you want to be in the water and you don't want the water to come in the boat. I wonder if there's some kind of nautical metaphor that we can use, that we want to sail along this idea of smart cities and technology without allowing the technology, the water itself, to sink us as people. I'm just kind of wondering, kind of going down that direction a little bit.
That's a good metaphor.
Yeah?
Like I said, I'm trying to think of I mean, it's, this might be silly. I'm going to try one on for size.
No, silly's good. This is a heavy topic. Let's go for silly.
Right. Okay. So let's say that you're paddling a canoe. You can canoe with one person. You just have to be able to move the oar back and forth on either side of the boat. It's a lot of work. You can add a second person to the boat who can be a helper to you that can really aid you in being able to navigate the water well. But if you don't teach that second person how to use the canoe properly, if you don't coordinate with them, what you could end up with is either more weight in the boat and it's actually slowing you down, or you can end up with you both, say, paddling on one side and you're just going around in circles and not actually progressing, even though it feels like you're actually moving forward. And so that's how I would really say, I think a lot of this smart city technology is that second person in the boat. We really have to be intentional in the way that we coordinate it, that we regulate it, to make sure that it is actually moving us towards solving larger problems, that we're not ending up just going in circles or actually causing more problems than when we started with. And I would say, for example, the risk of privacy that we talked about earlier is an example of perhaps kind of going around in circles. Now you're not only working hard in the canoe, but you're actually going in circles too, and causing more problems than when you started. So that's how I would define it.
That wasn't silly at all. I appreciate that. That's a good metaphor. And with that, we're going to close up.
I appreciate his metaphor. I think as a municipal official, and I think officials at all levels of government, except maybe right up in Washington, I have no idea how we regulate it. And Mad Magazine shut down this month, and Alfred E. Newman, and what me worry. We all need to be worrying.
Yeah, and I think that it is going to be difficult to regulate, especially when you were saying, for example, a lot of the regulations are at a federal level, but a lot of the technology, with smart cities and a lot of the public the institutions as a whole that are being affected, like libraries, for example, are at the local level. And so there really is an interesting mismatch there that's going to be. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially in the next 5 to 10 years, which is really this inflection point for, how we decide what that second person in the canoe is going to do for us.
Wow, that's excellent, Noah. That's excellent, Noah. And you know what? So I think at this point, we're going to have to close our conversation down as we think about smart cities, because we could really probably go on for a long time. We are really just scratching the surface, as you said, Noah and George, in this idea of integrating intelligent information into our cities. Thank you so much for being part of our conversation tonight.
Please join us next week as we discuss aging, Alzheimer's, and the way we tap into storytelling and literacy with senior adults. Our guests are Dr. Jennifer Butte, an accomplished physician living with early onset Alzheimer's, and writers Louise Morse and Jordan Gross. Don't forget to subscribe to the AfterwordPodcast.com, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and you are welcome to join the conversation at our table next week about aging, Alzheimer's, and storytelling.